Great. So the roadmap for where we're going. So we're going to think about finding and developing leaders in ministry and mission. In the first session, I want to kind of just give you an outline of this idea of apprenticeship to get a flavour for that. And we'll talk and we'll interact, we'll buzz with some of that. In the second session, I want to drill into how we can use the churches that we're leading, the Christian communities that we're engaged with, simultaneously as places of mission and ministry and places that are training and multiplying new leaders and new disciples. So how do we inject that? How do we work? And critically, what's your role in that? What does your leadership shape look like if you're doing that? And then thirdly, it may seem a little odd, but I want to pull in this idea of creativity and propose to you why that's quite a key idea for what we're doing, and to unpack two dimensions, two areas in which creativity might be key to what we're trying to do, where we are in the story of Christianity in our nation, what we're trying to achieve, and how we might achieve it. Why is creativity key and vital to some of that? What I'd love to do first is just collect some expectations. It's always a bit dangerous. We've got 2 hours and 25 minutes, so I'm going to ask you to tell me what you'd like to get out of this session. So the danger is that you want a pay rise and a sabbatical, so I can't help you with any of that. You might want an electric car. I haven't got any of those either, and apparently you wait a very long time to get that. So there are limits to what we can do, but I'm really happy to redirect any of the material or to put something in if you feel like, oh, we really want to talk a bit more about that. So let's hear some of that. On this topic, finding and developing leaders in ministry and mission, what kind of stuff do you want to hear today? What would help you? What are the big challenges you are facing? What are the unsolved problems that you're trying to solve? What are the opportunities that are opening up? What's changing that you're figuring out? What are you unsure about in terms of your role? Let's have a few of these. Let's just go around. Yeah.
Finding and raising leaders ex nihilo, as in from where?
Yeah.
From nothing.
Brilliant.
Repeat that for me.
So the first one was finding, where do we find leaders from? Finding them from what base?
Yeah, I think I'm building on that, building a smooth pipeline.
Smooth pipeline. Brilliant. Let's have some more.
How do we deal with the kind of fear that people carry with them?
Is that you, or is it the people you're training up?
I think it's both. I think it's the people who train and the people who are doing the training.
Yeah, that's great. And what kind of fear might it be? Have you got an example, just to illustrate?
Well, I guess that people hold fears of if they're the ones that we have identified to be empowered, they've got the fear of, have I got enough time? Can I do it?
Okay.
What's the expectation? And those who are doing the kind of empowering, there's nobody there, where are they? And putting too much on them, there's all that kind of stuff that we carry.
That's great.
So there's a deeper fear than that too, if I may,
Yeah.
of correlation of leadership with toxicity and the impacts for that, or being placing themselves in places on
Great. Keep going.
There are some particular challenges that some of our churches face, which I think is to do with context. So I'm thinking of estate churches particularly, where you have a very small base, but particularly people who perhaps have never had any sense of so many things in life are not in place. How do we raise leaders up in that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, two at the back, and then Sophie.
Empowering people to change, that they don't have to do the same thing over and over again, that they can use their own creativity, as you say on there, to change and make things fun.
Yeah, fun. I like that. And next, Chris.
Something about it's a step change in the culture, so doing this in a careful way, which brings people with us and making sure we don't leave anyone behind.
Brilliant. Sophie?
paying particular attention to underrepresented groups, global majority heritage, disabled, and other protected characteristics, and recognising our unconscious bias. So we're looking for people who look like us,
Yeah.
comfortable to be around, and could be our friend.
Yeah. That's excellent. A few more. Yeah.
I think maybe also something about helping the rest of the church to acknowledge lay leadership. Sometimes that's quite difficult in certain contexts.
That's great. Someone just put me on the right track. Will a focal leader always be lay, or might they be ordained as both? Okay, majority lay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
What are the risks
Of doing this?
of raising up and developing leaders?
Yeah,
It's much handier if I stay in control.
yeah. Yeah, know the feeling. Any more? Yeah,
Just finding people that have got the time. Majority of the people that we know who would make really good potential leaders are really committed to all sorts of other stuff.
yeah, there will be. Let's have one more.
It's something about young people, children. When does this begin?
Yeah,
Begin at the beginning? Or is there an age when that's okay? And so there are generational differences in some of the ways that we live at that.
yeah. That's fantastic. Okay, I'm going to get you to talk for a sec, partly just to kind of activate our engagement, etc. I've got 3 statements about the church on the screen, and I want you to talk to the person next to you about them. You will be drawn to one or the other. You'll be scared by one or confused by one, frustrated. You maybe think, yes, I'd love to do that, or no, we could never do it. So maybe like the one at the top from Irenaeus, the Greek mission bishop to France, very old. The church is planted like paradise in this world. I love that the vision for the church is that it's a bit of paradise on the street corner and in the local neighbourhood. Or the comment that was made to Nicky Gumbel when he was trying to open St Peter's Brighton, and everybody else, the bishop, the archdeacon, the area dean, the PCC and the vicar all wanted to close it. And then one of the archdeacons said to him, a closed church is like the empty palace of a long forgotten king. And people walk past and say, the king is dead. Oh, it's a bit gloomy, isn't it? Or maybe the one from T.S. Eliot, from his poetry, the church must be forever building and always decaying and always being restored. Do you want to find just in twos and just buzz with that for about 3 minutes, and then I'd love to hear just what you're reacting to emotionally for those 3 statements. Okay, I said we were going to kind of wander our way into this idea of the medieval guild, so we'll do that for the rest of this session. And we're going to begin by thinking about apprenticeship. So you're going to talk again in a minute in your groups. Let me read this. In past generations, apprenticeship-style training has been key to the effective transformation of a novice into a master. Let me just pause there. I'm using the word master there because that's the historically used word. In the guilds, they're all basically run by men. When I use the word, I'm thinking of a man or a woman. The proper female term would be mistress, but it just doesn't quite work. So I've stuck with the word master, although you could substitute expert or leader or trainer, but master has the richest of meaning. So translate that in your head as you hear it used for the rest of the day. Through the acquisition of craft skills and the development of the worker's personal creativity and distinct style. This mode of learning is significantly different to the didactic classroom training model, which is ubiquitous in most modern formal learning systems and central to most models of Christian ministerial formation in the Western world. So can you note the difference? the way we train in the West is very different from the long-standing historic models. Our model is a fairly recent one. The idea that you go and sit in a classroom and you read a book and you write an essay in order to understand something. That's what we're going to try and tease out this morning. For nearly 700 years, up to the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, medieval craft guilds trained most English youths and young adults. This was achieved through a specific form of guided apprenticeship, which involved hands-on training, evidence-based educational progression, community learning, and the creative development of a worker's craft skills. Through the workshops of the guilds, explicit, tacit, and embedded knowledge was passed from one generation to another through training delivered by expert masters who personally tutored apprentices. So I think that cuts to the heart of what we're trying to achieve in finding and developing people who will take on leadership roles in the churches that we have oversight for. And I think there is some ancient treasure for us to rediscover and reactivate, some of which will feel sort of oddly familiar, but it's almost like, oh yeah, I get that, but it's kind of like we all end up sitting in classrooms reading books and writing essays, and yet I can see how the history has got us to this place where we're training in a certain way. So we'll unpack the guilds a bit more in a minute, but I want you to chat again, perhaps this time in threes, and I'm going to ask you the question, who are you apprenticing? Think wide, okay? If you live in a house with other people, perhaps you are apprenticing someone in something. I recently taught someone to drive. I apprenticed them into driving, so that would count. Maybe you train some sport. Maybe you have a hobby interest. Maybe you do something with your neighbours or your friends or your family, things that maybe are nothing to do with your job, but you have an apprenticeship type relationship with one or more people. So let's buzz with that and see what we come up with, and see as well if we're surprised. Maybe we're apprenticing more people than we realise. So do you want to do that in a three? A two would be okay, but maybe a two or a three at your tables. I'll give you 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back. Let me give you some examples from church, and I want to talk about three things that I did. Until recently, I was leading a church plant called G2, and we played a lot with developing leaders. So I'm unpacking some of the things that we did. I'm quite shy, and I'm nervous when I talk about myself, but I want to give you three examples. But I'm not in any way suggesting I brought the best examples today. So I know you will all have examples as well, but I want to bring this into, okay, how does this find its energy within the life of the church? And also the examples I've got, I think were really effective as well. So I do want to sort of say these things worked really well as illustrative ideas of developing leaders in the church. So the first is called Ignition. And Ignition was born out of necessity, because when I was first starting G2 and leading it, I had a job. And so I had a limited amount of time, and I had a whole range of, I had to lead the whole thing. And just the thought that every week I would also have to produce a sermon, I just thought it's not going to work. It's going to dry up very quick. And I also just felt deep down, I don't think people want to hear from me every week. Like eventually, like after about 4 weeks, they've probably heard everything I know. And then it's just like, you're repeating, because we've all, so you know all that anyway. So I understood I need to find a way to get a whole load of other people speaking. And I had a retreat day with a friend of mine, Luke Smith, and we just kind of retreated the problem together. So we prayed about it in the morning, then in the afternoon we kind of just played around with ideas, and we came up with actually a few ideas. Ignition was only one of them. And the idea for Ignition Sunday, we thought, how can we get people to speak when they don't know how to speak? And how can we, increment them along? It felt like, it'd be a really big thing just to put somebody who's never done this before in front of the whole church, even though we weren't that big, and then they would have to do a whole, so that's quite a high level of skills and experience and confidence to put together. So we came up with this idea that we would ask 4 people, we started with 3 actually, we would ask 4 people and we would invite them to do a 5-minute talk. And the invitation became that if you've never done a talk in church, then you can sign up for Ignition. So you couldn't do it more than once. Ignition was for people doing something for the first time. And for nearly all of them, it was the first time they'd ever done any kind of talk, even at work or in any other context. We picked 4 because I found if one drops out of 3, two doesn't quite land as well. If one drops out of 4, you've got 3, it still kind of works. And then let me cut to the end before I tell you how it worked. On my last Sunday at G2, we had our 100th Ignition speaker. So through this simple program, we actually invested in 100 people, most of whom went on to be regular speakers, either in a church context or another context. So we were very surprised at the impact it had. We were also very surprised at how quickly people advanced in their skills. And something about that was about the discernment of people, almost understanding when the fruit's ready to be picked, not picking too early, not leaving it too late. And in fact, we got audited a few years into being G2 that the Archbishop asked for the visitor to bring a team to assess us on a Sunday. And the person speaking was doing their second talk. So their second talk was a full Sunday talk. Their first talk had been an Ignition 5 minutes. And in the write-up, the person accidentally said, the person that was speaking, I think she was a licensed reader. So I went back to him and said, she's not a reader. And he went, oh, licensed preacher, something? No, that's her second talk. Anyway, I had an argument with the Archdeacon because he wouldn't believe that was only her second talk. But that was just an interesting observation about having an eye for picking a person at the right time and giving them the right opportunity that they're ready for and to develop into. So G2 was prolific in raising up speakers. It also had a knock-on effect in the culture of the church. It kind of said, this is a place where gifts are valued and opportunities exist. So we found it kind of spilled over into worship leading and the tech team and children and youth and other things. And so it's almost as if we'd picked an iconic ministry and then it sort of owned and named a value within the church, and that had a spill-over effect. The model was quite simple. So we invite people to do a 5-minute talk on a single verse of the Bible. I always did it that way because some never listened and they just tell you a story about a dream or a trip they went on. But on balance, normally the 2 out of the 4 or 3 out of the 4 will do it on a Bible verse. So you tend to get a bit of Bible, a bit of story, a bit of prophetic. And I just found it tended to even out. It felt okay. We said 5 minutes because if you say 10, you get 15. So we did 5. So we just make it feel really short. And then we had a model that initially was just a bit ad hoc, but became quite a fixed model, which would be you will meet up with a coach at least once beforehand. We have a rehearsal together the week before, and you do your talk. So you don't tell us what the talk will be, you do the talk. It's a rehearsal. And if you're feeling a bit rusty, you still do the talk. And then we get to give you feedback and encouragement and maybe minor suggestions on tweaking, but we tried not to mess too much with what people were doing. We found that instilled confidence. When I led those, and by the time we got to the 100, I wasn't leading it. I was leading the people who were leading the people who were leading the ones that did it, because we had a whole hierarchy of people that were trained up. So people just trained people to do what they'd been trained in. But when I was leading the first ones, what I found it was my opportunity to say to people, that's a fantastic talk. I can't wait to hear that on Sunday. That's going to really bless the church. And what I'm doing is I'm just taking away all those unspoken anxieties that they've got, that it's heresy, that it's it's stupid, it's childish, no one wants to hear this, somebody said the same thing better the previous week. All those things that people do to disqualify themselves and therefore to not be confident and alive on Sunday, I found we could eliminate those. And then what I used to do on Sunday is when I introduced the speakers, I would use my authority as the ordained minister to make room for them. So I would say things like, you're going to be really encouraged because I've already heard these talks and they're so good. So that's me telling the church, I don't need you to vet this talk, I've vetted it for you. So it's approved, it's an approved message. So you just need to receive it. Because what I found is some of the older people were sitting there and then they'd come up to me afterwards and basically tell me if they thought it was okay or not. And I realized, oh, you're being spectators rather than participants. So G2 had a profound impact on the culture of leadership, and it also spilled over into, so when I left, I did some of the sums. I reckon 50 people went from G2 into some kind of Christian ministry. Not that that's the only ministry. I'm not saying that's more important than being a school teacher or something like that, but that's an indicator of activation of people. And we had, I think, 17 people that went through to get ordained in the Church of England as priests as well. So that's the first example.
Christian, how often did you do an Ignition Sunday?
3 times a year. So we just did 1 a term. And I could have done more. The church loved it. It was their favourite. If I said next week's Ignition, they'd be like, yes! There'd be cheers. Which, if you're a regular preacher, you'd think, oh, I thought my talks were good. Yeah.
So the Ignition Sunday was when they delivered the talks?
Yes.
Or any idea for, I guess, the intake of the next round?
So Ignition Sunday was the Sunday when they delivered the talks. And that was also the point when there was usually the most sign-up. Because people didn't sign up in the abstract. It was almost like, if you want to do one of those, sign up. And people would sign up for it.
I remember I heard you talk about this on another occasion. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. But when they were really young as well, a lot of them.
Our church was young.
Yeah.
So 70% of the adults in our church were under 30. Yeah. So the average age of the G2 speakers was mid to low 20s, but that was just a factor of the church. We did a few with youth. Confidence was an issue. So for a couple of the youth, I videoed them, and then I played the video with them in there. So it felt like live, but so that helped them with their confidence. And I think the youngest was a 7-year-old, but he was very confident. And I think maybe there was one that was a video. There was one, a mother and daughter had written a song, so they just played their song, and they explained the song. So we had a few kind of randoms like that pulled in different age groups. Yes?
I was just really encouraged because when I was a vicar in London, I had people who wanted to learn to preach. So I'd say, come along to, we used to have a service at the residential home early on the Sunday and then the service in church. And I'd say to them, right, these are the rules, 5 minutes, 1 point, loud.
Yeah.
And people could cope with that.
Yeah.
And you could see what they were like. I mean, you've got so much more here. I think, I could have done all that as well. But generally, it was a great place to sort of love people, give them that first opportunity.
Yeah.
And see how they developed. And if they were good, you could then begin to introduce them.
Yeah, that's great. I've got another one. So just the point of Ignition was we stumbled on it. So I'm not saying just copy, because I think the reason it worked is I had a kingdom challenge and I needed to go to God and get a solution, and I processed it through prayer and discussion with someone who was wise, and we came up with something that just seemed to fit us at the right moment, and we played a spiritual hunch and we developed it along the way, and then it became a thing. So, I think the process is really important, but I'm offering it as an illustration, as a way of doing very simple apprenticeship type training in a church. Yes,
I
Ian.
nicked this idea, I think from Luke Smith actually.
Yeah.
We did it slightly differently. So we did it occasionally, and we have often a young person or somebody, similar category at the beginning of the service, as the ignition talk, to kick off.
Yes.
Before the worship set.
Yeah.
Nothing lost if it's
yes.
Disastrous. If it's brilliant, then we would actually develop it. Then sometimes tagged. The next opportunity to tag a preach.
Yeah.
You prepare a sermon with a preacher, and I did the first bit, then the middle, and the end again. So that kind of developed. But that was a genius idea, which led us to have to this unearthing 2 or 3 preachers.
Yeah, brilliant. Hannah.
Christian talked to me about this about a year ago probably, so we've had a little go and tried it. And we've had quite a few people, we call it Short Talk Sunday, and we get 2 of them up. And it's, a couple of them preached, I think, once since then, and we're involving them now in our preaching group. What we haven't done, which we need to work on, is the coaching. We haven't done that as much, and I think that would really, for us, just hearing you speak about it now is a reminder to kind of improve that. But what I have seen in doing it is that the individuals who've had a go it's really accelerated their own spiritual life, and they've taken a bit more ownership on their own kind of devotional life and learning. So it's been really good, but we've just dropped off a bit, so we need to pick it up and have another go.
Yeah. You remind me, I'll say 2 other points about this. The first, I learned a lot through doing this about how to do church. One of the things I learned was the point you made, Sophie. We all carry bias. And there was a point when I realised I'm looking for people like me. And there was a point when I realised I believe in women and men in leadership, but I only seem to have men in leadership. And I realised I am the problem, because I'm the gatekeeper to the invitations. What Ignition did is it provoked us because we changed the mode of the invite. The invite was anyone can do it. And I was pretty easygoing about, I would be as generous as I could with, sometimes you know stuff about people, so sometimes you think, should they do that? I was as generous as I felt I could be with that, because it was a one-off talk, and it's a short talk, and it's under supervision, and so I felt that's okay. I think I only once asked somebody not to do it because of something they told me that had happened that was quite a big thing. But what it helped me to do is realise I can do better as a gatekeeper to providing opportunity, and I am programmed to see potential in certain people more than others. So when I talk to a young guy, I perceive potential in a way that I wasn't perceiving with women, and I had to retrain myself to see that. Same with age, social class, whatever. We will all have bias, and your biases will be different from mine, but the point is you've got them, and you need to work on them. The other thing that helped is, very quickly, it wasn't just me doing it. In fact, even the first one, it was me and Luke, and so there was never just one voice deciding who could. That was a helpful thing. The second thing I think it helped me to do was just to train that sense of when is the right time to ask. And it's a very intuitive thing, and so it could easily be that you show bias in that. But I felt over the years, I really improved my sense of getting the timing right to ask people, and increasingly just playing a hunch that I think they're ready for this now. Or if I support them in this way, they could do this next, and we could keep this development journey going. And I realised that it's like a skill. I go wine tasting every year, so I talk to French vineyard owners in my terrible French and try and ask them questions. And I asked one, how do you know when the grape's ready? So he says, it's about 30 years of training. I followed my father, I followed my grandfather. He goes, after about 30 years of that, you sort of know when the grapes are ready. And also the grape tastes nothing like the wine. So to link those in your head and to know, horrible grape, beautiful wine, to understand the connection is quite a sophisticated talent, as is seeing the potential in people. So Luke Smith's a good example. His first talk was awful, but I saw some fire in him that I thought, that's amazing. Can't give him the fire. We can help him structure his talk just to communicate a bit better. The second was Big Ideas. Big Ideas was a system, I called it a system, for planning Sundays, and we did it once a term. And I did this because I realised I wanted to get more people in the room. The danger was just me did the planning, or me and the senior team, the staff, did the planning. And I realised this could be a formational thing. I could help them to gain buy-in, not just for what we're doing, but why we're doing it, and how have we made decisions, and what do we want to get out of this? What do we think this series that we're planning on such and such a book in the Bible, what are we hoping it might do, etc. So Big Idea was a meeting where we'd get people together. We would bring everyone in, and it also equalised the hierarchy in the church, because I realised there's a hierarchy, preachers at the top, worship leader comes next. The reason I know that's that way is the worship leader rings the preacher to say, what's my theme? And well, why does it go that way? Why is the preacher in charge? So Big Idea sort of set us on the same journey where we could say, here's what we think we're doing in these Sundays, and now we all know what we're doing, we can all go away and plan our different bits, how the service will be led, how the worship will be led, even how the welcome might be done, or how the preaching's done, etc. So Big Idea was where we just played with that, and we would invite a lot of people into the room. We would talk about what we were doing, and the aim, we were drawing people in. We were trying to draw them in. So I'll pick this up in the next session, but I think that's a helpful idea of how to lead differently in such a way that you're also subtly developing people along the way. And the third was a point when we realised when we were getting too big for the room we were in. And we had one service, and I realised, okay, to keep growing, we need to change the format. So I taught the church through my thinking, and I said, we're growing, and we'd like to continue to grow, and it seems to me we have two options. We either get a bigger room, or we get additional rooms. And then I said, I want us to get additional rooms, and that was the transition for us to become a multi-site church where we met in different places simultaneously on Sunday. My logic was this: if we have more people in one room, the ratio of opportunities for people to be involved decreases as the church grows. If we multiply, then actually we increase the opportunities for people to do on-the-job learning as we continue to grow. And that, it was a big transition because it added more complexity to the leadership. It meant some people had to step up into, like Josh and Ellie, to leading a congregation. And it also meant my role had to change significantly, and I had to surrender quite a lot of say over the day-to-day and what would happen on Sunday and how would it do, because I now needed other people to own that. And then I had to learn how to support and develop them in that. So it meant I had to transition into an oversight ministry and allow them to be focal ministers. Okay. Right, we've got 3 minutes, so we're going to go over a little bit into the coffee break. Let me tell you briefly about the guilds. That will just set us up ready for our next conversation, where we talk about the idea of the church as a workshop of training. So the medieval craft guilds, they're examples from York, just near from where my office used to be at St Michael the Belfry, the York Minster stonemasons and the Minster glaziers. So the two remaining craft institutions that follow some of the kind of guild methodology in the way that they train. It's of course significantly different, but you can feel the guild model in the way they do it and the way they structure and the way they talk. So the guilds were the way in which almost all business and trade and almost all training and learning was done for the 700 years up to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a big changing point in how work was done, but it was also a big changing point in how learning and teaching was done. In the world of the guilds, which was medieval and old, of course, everyone was an artist. Whatever you did, you were an artisan in it. If you made bread, you were an artisan bread maker. If you made shoes, you were an artist who worked with the leather to make shoes. That was how they thought and talked. That was the culture and feel of training and what you became through your learning. It had this artistic approach. What the Industrial Revolution did is, firstly, it changed jobs into machine work. So instead of being an artisan woodmaker, you became a machine operator, and the machine churned out table legs or whatever it might be, and no longer was your personality applied to what will this chair look like. No longer was it shaped by how does this wood want to be carved, or how do I like to carve it, or what tools do I have. It became a sort of uniformity type thing. So the person doing the job became de-skilled but mechanistic, and the product became sort of same. So the creativity piece was lost. Now, certainly, of course, there are lots of advantages. You know, if I buy a car, I don't want an artisan car where someone's just gone, I wonder what the engine could look, you know, I want a really well-engineered one where they spent £20 million figuring that out. So I'm not dissing the manufacturing approach. But in our world, I think we lean more to the artisan type of what does it look like for people to be drawn into the service of God. The other thing the Industrial Revolution did, though, is it changed what training looked like. So training became more like science and engineering than learning in an artist's studio how to be an artisan. And actually, I think we still have that now. So, you know, you go to Vicar Factory, you train for a designated number of years. But a lot of that is a very engineering, scientific approach to training that presumes all sorts of things about how an individual might be activated and skilled and empowered in ministry. Now, it's much more flexible than it ever has been, and it's much more aligned to individuals than it ever has been. But even still, there's the premise of how we do ministry formation, particularly the theological college bit, is actually quite mechanistic, systematic, and sort of linear compared to how ministers of the church might have trained in times past. Yeah. And then also some people who apparently have very little to say in terms of qualification are utterly fantastic. And the comparison people often make these days is Peter and Paul. You know, Jesus gave Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and the Catholic Church would see him as the leading minister of the church, yet he was an unschooled fisherman. So he's a successful businessman, probably couldn't read, probably. Paul, so clever, he can tell us the name of his tutor, and we're like, oh, Gamaliel, oh my word. When Gamaliel died, it was said at his funeral, the law of God will never be taught again, as in the best the world has ever seen just died. So that was, anyway, let's not drift onto that. But we need to recover that. We need to be able to license a Peter with as much confidence as we would a Paul. Yes. And also celebrate, there's some things Peter could do that Paul couldn't, some things Paul could do that Peter couldn't. Let me introduce you to three characters, and then we'll have our break, because we need to do that before we do the next session. So, three principal characters in the guilds that are helpful, and this probably will map onto your oversight and focal ministry outlooks. First is an apprentice. In the guilds, the apprentices are often youth. Some might be as young as 6 or 7. Usually apprentices were signed over to their master's house. It was almost like they were adopted. So if the police picked up an apprentice for some misbehaviour, they would take them to their master, not their parents. So that's just interesting how strong the training and working bond would be. The apprentice vowed, the master vowed to take care of the apprentice, and the apprentice vowed to serve faithfully and keep the master's secrets, as in, I will treasure what you teach me, because it's precious stuff. And it had commercial value, that's why it had to be kept as a secret. Apprentices varied in time, it depended on the age, but often it was 7 years, sometimes it was less, but bear in mind they were starting quite young, so some of them would be primary school age kids. The second person is a journeyman. Well, I'll put it as a woman because we're talking about men and women. So a journeyman, French journée day. A journeyman is someone who can be paid a day's wage. So they're a skilled worker. They're an intermediate person. They have enough skill to be out doing carving the stone, making the shoes, whatever it might be. And they have completed their apprenticeship. And the way they've completed their apprenticeship is they have produced what are called pieces. And pieces, like if you were a carpenter, pieces might be make a table and a chair and chairs. Does that make sense? There's a place in Ireland, Waterford Crystal, where they still practice this. You graduate from your apprenticeship in learning how to cut glass when you can make the apprenticeship bowl. So you're given a plain crystal glass bowl, and you have a week to do the 26 cuts with finishes and the fluting. And if you can complete that in a week, you're no longer an apprentice, you're part of the team. And the rule is you can ask anyone for advice, but no one can touch your bowl. And then you're assessed by the team you join. So it's in their interest to not go easy on you, because if you're not up to scratch, you'll slow them down and they won't earn as much money. So they still practice that. So I said to them, how long does the apprenticeship take? They said, it's the wrong question. You can sit your exam the next week and do the bowl. And if you can make the bowl, you're not an apprentice anymore. You've graduated. Some people take 10 years or 15 years. It's not about how long the training we put you through. It's about you demonstrating the evidence that you've learnt the basics and you're ready for the next phase. So that was the journeyman, and the journeyman typically had to leave. So they had to leave the workshop for 3 years minimum and travel. And I met some modern German stonemason journeymen who said they have a ceremony, they drink beer with the master the night before, he puts a nail through their ear to sort of like made in Germany, something like that kind of thing. The next morning, they walk you to the city wall. The apprentices lift you over the city sign, and then you are to walk away without looking back, and you're not to come within 30 kilometres of your master's workshop for the next 3 years. And then the journeymen were told, these journeymen were told, and that was the medieval pattern as well, that they were to travel in that period, and because they can be paid, they were to travel and go to different workshops and work there for a period of time. And the idea would be they would increase their training through doing that. So I've learned from one master, now I'm going to learn from another master. And inevitably, the second master would know some things that the first one didn't. So you're building your skills. And because you've been apprenticed enough, you don't know everything, but you know enough to continue learning, self-learning. You know enough to know, okay, how do I learn this from this person? And I asked these German stonemasons, how many do you do? So he said, well, our master told us, when the postman knows your name and the dogs stop barking, it's time to move. He said, brackets, about every 3 months. So the idea was every 3 or 4 months, they should go to the next workshop, and then they'd learn the next thing and the next thing. And then when you've completed your, and this was called the wandering years. When you've completed your wandering years, you would return to your master's workshop, and you would now produce your evidence from your second phase. of learning. So the first evidence was called pieces. Can you guess what the second evidence was called? So the second evidence was called a master's piece. So that's the origin of that word. A masterpiece is evidence that a journeyman has completed their second phase of learning, and the masterpiece should demonstrate your basic skills plus those additional skills that you learnt on your travel. And the guild of masters were your assessors, and if they judged that your masterpiece was sufficiently strong, you would become a master and you would enter the third phase of their guild life. Some guilds only let you have one go, and if you didn't pass, you could never come back. Some would let you have another go. You could go and do another year's wandering and come back. And then the third character is that's a dreadful picture, but the third character is is the master. So the master is a man or woman. So the master is, well, it's you. So the master is someone, they have proven their practitioner expertise. They've proven that they can continue to learn and show the evidence, and they have been judged by their peer community to be fit to train the next generation. And their qualification for train is how well they've done it. So they've done it, now you can teach others what you have done. And you've shown us that you can learn and that you can train and teach others. And therefore to be a master gave you permission to set up your own workshop and to call your own apprentices. Okay, we're over time. Shall we stop there and have our 15-minute break? And then we'll pick up after that. Okay, so that was an example. So I think sometimes if you create a different opportunity, you remove that pathway. And I recognised that I had to face my biases. That was a revelation moment to me when I realised I am the reason why there are not women leading in this church. By the way, what I did about this is, first of all, I repented. Second, I told the church that I had let them down and I needed to change it. So then I was accountable because I'd said it out loud. And then we made our numbers available. So I said, we'll report every month to the church the number of men and women that were involved in different areas. And in about a year, the numbers had changed to nearly equal. So I also realised it was all there ready, waiting to be released, but I was the one that needed to release it. And it took conscious effort initially to make it happen. So we had to be more methodological about how we did it. And we also had to learn, at the time, we had to deal with men and women on the whole differently. Because I found when I talk to men and say, would you like to do a talk? It was almost like, at last, like, how come it's taking you this long to notice the untapped talent? You know, so there was that was a typical male example. What I found when I talked to women is I could tell they were probably thinking something like, has he mixed me up with someone else? and I found women usually said no. And we actually, as a team, kept a tally, and we had a 3-ask rule. So the rule was a person got asked 3 times, and it was usually women that got to the end of this rule. They got asked 3 times, and if they'd said no 3 times, and we were thinking they should do this, we have confidence in them, but they don't, then I would take them out for a coffee and really be really clear. I want you to do this. I am inviting you to do it. Sophie.
Can I ask about voices? Because I've just read Mary Ann Seacart's book about the authority gap. And she's done lots of she's done lots of research about the way women's voices are received and heard. So we know that there are all sorts of awful things that are said to women and about women.
Yeah.
in relation to their speaking. I mean, there's stuff to do with appearance as well, which we won't go there. But actually their voice, just thinking about them coaching them to do talks, did women, presumably men and women, so that you coached each other? It wasn't that women coached women particularly, or was it?
No.
I'm wondering about how you help people find their voice and whether there was any differences in the gender thing, just that you said we had to work with people differently. I'm just interested in that.
So what I quickly learned, and I passed on to others in the people doing the ignition talk, was the coach's job was not to meddle in the talk as much as they wanted to, as much as they wanted to say, why don't you say this? Or give them. Yeah, so what I was trying to help them to understand was, your job is to activate their voice. So and you need to hold back judgment. It doesn't matter whether you would do it differently. Your job is to allow them to have an authentic talk. The second thing, I mean, someone like Hannah Smith, Luke Smith's wife, the first time I asked her to preach, and she said no, and I said, why not? And then I took her out for a coffee, and she told me why not. And she said she didn't want like the big Bible thing. She didn't want she thought that was preaching, big leather Bible, aggressive stance, lectern. So she said to me, could I sit on a stool and could I use my Bible? And she said, I don't want to do a preach, I want to do a talk from the Bible. And I thought, that sounds like a preach to me, but if you want to call that a talk from the Bible.
That's really interesting, because we bought a pair of bar stools for our evening service. And so I would sit, or whoever was leading service would sit on one, and the person giving a little talk, because it was a smaller setting, so we do our trial talks there. Was on a bar stool, so that was quite interesting. And people, all sorts of people, were happy to come and sit on the bar stool who wouldn't have got in the pulpit, not we use the pulpit really, but on the dais. So that's quite interesting. But on the gender front, you didn't particularly notice how women's voices were received or heard by the church. I suppose that's what the bit that I was thinking about.
I knew early on people were judging people either because of inexperience, gender, or other reasons they judged. And I knew I had to bully the church a bit to say, I have already loved these talks. So basically, if you're not happy, you're falling out with me because I've pre-approved. And I felt like that was me just using my license to make room. I was lending them my safety and confidence whilst they found their feet.
Because you'd sort of dealt with your own bias.
Yes.
That's brilliant. Yeah, thank you.
So I was going to say something else on that. I can't remember what it was. And I would just listen carefully. Like one guy said, could I preach in my bare feet? Because I'm happiest. It was a really weird thing. And I did think, Jamie, that is weird. But basically he was saying, if I can take my socks off, I think I'll feel confident. So I was, of course you can. Of course you can speak. And so I was like, and Jamie's going to speak. And Jamie's opted to speak today in barefoot, which sounds excellent. And Jamie, over to you. And so, I could live with that. Yeah.
Did you find yourself, I mean, most of my context is, essentially you had a lot of graduate who at least have a go at preaching, and some of them try and look like me, and other of you don't do that. The other question is, do you find yourself wanting to vary up and exemplify different ways to be, just as we give people freedom?
Well, what helped is you can probably imagine that this became a rolling encouragement. So to begin with, it was just me encouraging a few others. But then once they got going, they were looking to other people for their example. And by that last Sunday, when the 100th person, I didn't know any of the 4 people, and they'd been prepped by people that I trained, who'd been trained by people that I trained. So it had so I was not anywhere in the pathway of what had inspired those 4 to say, yes, they'd done it because Holly asked them and because Sam asked them. And that was, if you remember what I said, that was basically where I wanted to get to. I just felt, if it's just me on Sunday, that feels rubbish. I want to lead a coloured thing and that's varied and interesting, and I want the quality to be great, I'll attend to that. I'll say one more thing before I move on. When I did the multi-site thing, basically we catapulted a whole load of people into a higher level of leadership, and I knew there was an element of risk, and also I had to surrender direct control to allow them to grow into the responsibility they were given. And there were a few blips along the way that were fun. One guy led a service, and he was really nervous. It's the first time he led a service, and he dropped the F-bomb. If you've seen that scene in Love Actually, that's basically what happened. And so I did my best on the day, just like, Gav, keep going, Gav, keep going. And then you can imagine I got a whole load of emails from parents telling me what words they prefer not to hear said in church. But I grabbed Gav afterwards and I said, mate, it's all me. Don't worry. I'll totally fix that. It's absolutely fine. And you are still on the rota to lead again. And so he did. And I realized I had to lift them up, celebrate their successes. So if Gav does a good job, Gav has done a good job, well done, Gav. And if Gav fails under my apprenticeship, that's on me to fix it, not him, because I invited him to do it. So if there's a mistake, it's mine. So he said, will the bishop be angry? I said, mate, the bishop doesn't know who you are. If he ever hears about this, which I doubt, he'll ring me up and he'll be cross with me. He will never talk to you, and that's the way it will be. So close that story. 2 years after, I'm getting a coffee at church for the service, and I hear Gav talking to a student, and I hear him saying to this, how you hear a conversation, he's just like, so I hear him talking to this student, and he said, no, this is a great church. If you do well, you'll get the credit. They don't take the credit for you. He said, mate, if you totally mess it up, they'll just take it from you and they'll fix it to help you grow and develop. And I thought, that's fantastic that we've modelled something through an event, something that went wrong. We've now instilled something that feels like it's now in the culture, and it's bubbling away there. Okay, we're going to talk about workshops. Two things first. The first is this. Somebody mentioned cost, and I want to flag this up. This is a medieval engraving, and it depicts, zoomed in on the left, the crucifixion of Peter, supposedly in Rome, and the beheading, top right, smaller, of Paul, also supposedly in Rome, not at the same time, but it's kind of a creedal summary of founding apostles and the Christian faith. And then the translations of what it says, at the top it says, they planted the church with their blood. And then underneath it says, Nero persecutes the church of God. Peter, the prince of the apostles, is affixed to the cross. The apostle Paul is smitten with an axe. This phrase, they planted the church with their blood, and variations of it, there's another one that the apostles planted the church with their blood, seems to be floating around very early literature. So this is not the artist's words. The artist is picking up, I think this is 1500, it's picking up some words that are, to him, heritage, identity heritage of the church. So this is like a recruitment poster for ministry in the church. It's saying, do you want to play a role in the church? Our heroes, the ones we follow after, they paid with their devotion, they paid for their devotion in the shedding of their blood. So it's almost like, would you like to be a focal minister? We have two options available. Pathway A leads to. So I think there is a cost to that. And if we have time, we might talk about resilience and burnout, because I think that is also a big issue in ministry, particularly when we're asking people to lead in their spare time, when it's squeezed into a small amount of time. So let's think about reimagining our churches as workshops of training, and maybe just to step back into thinking about what training is. We tend to lean heavily into the transfer of knowledge when we think about training. Hence, you do a theological degree. That's principally about the acquisition of knowledge, and that is brilliant. Like, we're probably that type of training is the best it's ever been in history, and the availability to the resources that make that work, books and whatever, you can get almost anything is available digitally now. A lot of it's available for free, etc., etc. So we're very well sorted in the area of knowledge, but there are at least two other areas that are key. The second is the development of skills. You can't learn skills in a teaching classroom. You can't. You can only learn skills in the context. Now, that's really what curacy is. So curacy is a journeyman experience. That's what it is, isn't it? And that's why it has to be not less than 3 years. That's the heritage of the guilds that's spilled over into our church formation. So curacy is seen as the time when you learn your skills. But arguably, we need to be much better at helping people to develop their skills. Often people can leave college, or maybe even leave at the end of IME2 if they're ordained, and they have a lot of knowledge, but they maybe don't yet have the robust skills that are necessary for the ministry that they're called to. So skills are important, and to acquire skills means apprenticeship, not reading books. Books can help, and I'm activated by reading. So if I read a book, my imagination explodes, and it makes me, and then I start seeing things, and then I start looking for opportunities. So I'm not saying reading a book is a waste of time, but it's not the best way to help somebody master skills. Apprenticeship is a much better way, where there's a master there watching you and guiding you and saying, that's great, just do it slightly differently, and giving you feedback and coaxing and coaching out of you the end result that you're trying to learn and discover. And then the third area, I think, is character. And I don't just mean moral character, that's important, but what I think I mean there is the strength of ministerial character. So, for example, I think anyone leading something, we really need to know what happens to you when you're under pressure. And if we don't know the answer to that, and if they don't know the answer to that, they are setting themselves up for potentially an enormous crash when that pressure comes, because it inevitably will. Especially if you're starting something, that whole experience is riddled with pressure. You feel like you've got to pull a rabbit out of a hat, and the bishop didn't give you a rabbit or a hat. And so you're just like, I don't know how we're going to do this. I feel all this pressure, and you've got to somehow be able to deal with that and press through. And so I would call that character. And again, character, you cannot form character in a classroom. You just can't. It's impossible. It's the wrong environment. So a theological college can never offer that. We need to understand, how can we lean into developing someone's character and helping them have that ministerial strength and guts and whatever, however you want to describe it, but I'm sure you can understand what I'm getting to. How can we train someone in it? And I do think we get trained in it. So we want to start you off with a little pressure, and then we'll give you the next pressure, and then we'll give you the next pressure, and we can grow in our confidence, in our skills, in our abilities to solve problems, in understanding where we go to help, understanding our internal limits. Is this too much for me? Is this within my capabilities? Understanding how to work collaboratively, because one person doesn't have all the answers, etc. So that's a huge area. Okay, let's talk about workshops. Let me just remind myself. Great. Okay. Workshops. I want you to imagine that church is in fact a workshop. That's the parallel we need to make between the guilds and what we're doing. Our workshops are our churches, and any of the activities our staff meetings, team meetings, prayer meetings, Sunday services, midweek groups, all those things in effect are the workshop of our craft that we're doing in serving Jesus. And the Guild workshop was a place of on-the-job learning. So in apprenticeship, we're talking about on-the-job learning. So this was the transition I went through in my time at G2 from I need to do all of the stuff because I've been trained. I got a license, so that's the expectation. To when I left G2, I mean, one of the reasons I left was I wasn't doing anything. And I just thought, at some point, someone will notice. So better to leave before they notice. Because I just trained people up and they'd got an appetite for it, and then I'd handed it on and I'd handed it on, and basically I oversaw the senior team, and they knew all the detail, and I totally trusted them. So a workshop needs to be a place, so our churches can be a place of on-the-job learning. I don't know, a bit like a teaching hospital. Have you ever been to a teaching hospital? I went once to have a wart removed off my chest. So I'm lying there. The doctor goes out, comes back with 12 teenagers. Apparently, qualified doctors. But some of them have got spots. Just, really? So, Mrs. Selvaratnam, you've got 2 warts to remove today. If you're happy, I'll remove one and the students will watch. And then the other one of the students will remove it. Well, I couldn't say no, the guys are in the room, aren't they? So, like, oh, that's fine, off you go. So they all have a poke, they all have a little look. But I knew, well, I'm investing in their training. They've got to learn somehow. I don't mind if it's me, maybe that saves someone else the experience. So that's the flip for us to think, not to think we do church and then we go somewhere else to train. What if when we're doing church, we are simultaneously training? And the way we do it is we've got our head around what is my role to do that, to oversee that really well, not to abdicate, but to delegate, to empower, and to be a really savvy, wise strategist in the delivering of that. And also, the workshops were very sophisticated in what they passed on, because some knowledge can be written down. Some knowledge is inherently hard to write down, and it's termed tacit knowledge. When I taught my son to drive, I did the speech that I always do when I teach. I've taught loads of people to drive. So I did the speech about the clutch, to talk it through it. And he interrupted me and he said, "Dad, I've watched some videos, okay? I've watched you, it seems really straightforward." So I thought, okay. So we swapped places, he got in. Off you go, Philip. So off he goes. I mean, you can imagine what happens. He grinds the gears, jumps in the clutch, he can't disengage it, total panic. And so I have to have a little explanation to him that explains, you do understand the theory, that's okay, but you actually need to sort of absorb that learning into your body, and it will just take a while. And what I was telling him was, there's some tacit knowledge that we need to impart to you through this process, and we can't get that from a video. The video gets you, 10% in, but then there's a bit that just has to happen through on-the-job training. And in the guilds, just as in our experience, that's how we pass knowledge from one generation to the other, by tutoring and training other people in that. Okay, we'll skip that. So let me talk about these areas, and then we'll have another chat in groups. So I want to talk about methods, workshops, and groups. Let's talk about methods first. So I've written a book about that. So that's basically my doctoral studies. I'm not trying to sell it because that's mine. I can't give you that one anyway. So if you want to buy it, wait a year and the price will drop on Amazon. It's a bit expensive at the moment. But I've documented all these in the book. What methods are taking place in a workshop of learning? What are the things we need to understand in how it works so we can reproduce that in our context? So 7 ideas. The first is situated learning. Situated learning is the type of learning that can only take place when immersed in the context. or it's learning that will best take place in the context. So, I'm sure it's obvious if you wanted to learn French, option A, have a French lesson in Sheffield every week. Option B, move to France for 3 months. Which route would get you into learning French better? Clearly the immersive experience. Even if you still just had one French lesson or something like that, there'll be something about being in the environment that just echoed everything to do with why you were there would be part of the learning. So that's the importance of the workshop. Being in the workshop is important. So I learned that I wanted the minimal delay between an invitation and an opportunity. I'll give you a good example. If you've heard of Miriam Swaffield, who's an amazing speaker, she was one of our first Ignition speakers, and Luke Smith invited her to do that talk. And she told me a few years later, she said, loads of people had said to me, Miriam, one day you'll be a great preacher. Like, clearly you've got, some communication ability. One day you could be a great speaker. She said, the difference that I experienced is Luke said to me, you look like you could be a great speaker. What are you doing in 2 weeks? And he booked her in to do something. So he immediately drew her into the opportunity to do that. So that's the idea of situated learning. That learning best takes place in the context. So actually at G2, I never ran any leadership training courses at all in 14 years. Everything we did to train leaders, we did through the ministry of the church, mainly through Sunday, but through the other things that we did. The second is communities of practice. And communities of practice is just simply a term for when we are in a group where other people are practicing and learning the thing that we want to learn as well. And the theorists say we're actually all in lots of those because they happen in all sorts of subtle ways. If we have a regular team meeting or a staff meeting, if we have a hobby or a club we're involved in, they constitute a community of practice because the people who are there for that shared purpose. They perhaps have differentiated levels of understanding, but the point is it forms a context where training opportunities arise richly. So the example I gave you of Big Idea was I didn't realise at the time, but what I'd done is I'd created a community of practice. And what it did is it brought different people at all sorts of levels into the space where we had that shared thing about what we were doing. And it's just helped people to develop. And some were ready for it and developed very quickly. Others took longer, and people were at different levels, and people could help each other. So if you can picture a medieval guild workshop where they're making shoes or something, and you've got some journeymen, and you've got some older apprentices, and you've got some younger apprentices, and you've got the masters, and you've got the glue over here, and you've got the leather here, and the wood there, and the tools there, and you've got the customers there. That's the idea of a community of practice. It's the rich space in which we are immersed in order to be kind of submerged into the context that we're learning. And the alternative is we sit in a classroom and read a book about it, and we are divorced from it, and we have very thin connections to it. So in a community of practice, we are completely immersed in that. With that comes this term legitimate periphery participation, which is a terrible phrase, but is simply a way of saying we become a learner when we have some connection to the ministry, to the activity. So rather than saying, like to Miriam, in years to come, you could probably be someone who does a talk, it's saying we want to... so this is about creating the connection. Okay. Creating a connection so somebody can participate. So I'll give you another example. Holly was my student worker, and it just seemed to me Holly had had an ability, she probably would be able to lead a congregation, and she actually did become one of our site leaders. But when she was a student worker, she was only 1 year out of university, and she was a bit green. And I thought, do you know what would help Holly is to see the bigger picture? I'm going to invite her to our senior leaders meeting. So I told her, I'm inviting you to the meeting, Holly, but there's some rules, and I picked her up in the car to take her to the first meeting. So I said, rule number one, you bring a notebook, take notes, because I'll ask you afterwards, what did you notice and what did you learn? Rule two, don't speak unless I invite you to, okay? Because what I'm doing is I'm getting you in the room. You are not a full member of this team, but I want you to be in the room with the team to see what happens when we talk and pray and how we make decisions. And I said, I'll probably at some point say, Holly, what do you think? At that point, be ready to say something. Don't waffle. Don't repeat what someone else has said. Be as brief as possible. And so I did. I would make sure I would draw her in. And my final rule was, I want you to stick to your subject. So only speak about student work. That's the expertise that you bring. After about 6 months, I remember saying to her, okay, Holly, you can forget the rules now. You're a full part of this team, so just participate however you want to be. And then I think a year after that, Holly said to me, she was no longer the student worker, she was something else, and we had a new student worker. And she said to me, could I invite the student worker? Because I really think if she could be in the meeting, it would really help her to develop. So I got the fun to say to Holly, that's brilliant. Holly, do you remember the rules? Can you talk her through the rules, and can you manage her through that process? And then and she brought the next person in through that. So that legitimate periphery participation is great. Is devising ways to quickly connect people in to doing some aspect of real ministry in the church. You know, it could be just as simple as saying, I've written a prayer, would you read it at the end and I'll stand next to you? And you're bringing them in, you're getting them connected, you're giving them a first step, and then you can give them some build up beforehand, and you can give them some feedback afterwards, and then you can ask them to do the next thing and the next thing, etc. Situational leadership theory is probably stuff you've heard of before. You've heard of the square. I do, you watch. I do, you join in. You do, I help. You do, you've got my phone number. And then we should add another one, which would be something like, you train someone else to do it. So that's what's termed situated leadership theory, and it's about progressively giving people more opportunity and you walking alongside them in that process. So for example, one of the things we did at G2 is we moved to having 2 people lead every service, because we just thought, okay, we need one person who knows how to lead the service, and then we have someone else who's learning how to lead a service. And the only way they can learn how to lead a service is by getting to do some of it within a safe environment. And I learned all I needed to do to train them was just to talk out loud. So I'd say, you sit next to me, and then I'll tell you what's happening as we're going. So if I'm listening to the talk, I'll say, okay, Holly, what I'm doing now is I'm just thinking, what might the Holy Spirit be doing in the church? Should we pray afterwards? Should we worship? Should it be intercession? So she said, how do you know? I said, well, I don't know. I'm listening to the talk. I'm praying as well. Have a see what I'm writing in my notebook. Somebody might come up, they might have a word that might help us, might ask the worship leader. And just by thinking out loud, my internal instinctive actions, I'm helping somebody else to get their head round, oh, I see how that works a bit. In the absence of that, they have no idea how you decide what you're going to do for that bit of the service or whatever it might be in your context. So that's situated leadership theory. And the theory behind that is that everyone has what's called a proximal zone of development. And that basically means discerning how far you can stretch someone in order for them to learn. So if you give someone too much, what you do is you break them. You take them beyond what they can do, and they can't do it, and it crashes, and it won't work. So there's an intuitive understanding to know, okay, I want to stretch you, but I'm not doing that in a stupid way. I'm doing that in a really clever, thought-out way, which includes me being there with you. But you will only continue to grow if I stretch you to give you the next thing and the next thing, to progressively hand on leadership. Mimetic learning is arguably the oldest form of learning in existence. It is learning by mimicry. And the argument is that's the principal way that all of us learn, but it's happening unconsciously. If you're a parent and you've ever found a child copying you, it's mimetic learning. So I remember once Amanda was making some bread, and, these are cliched examples. Amanda was making some bread, and Hannah, my daughter, was outside with mud and grass. And I remember looking and thinking, oh, she's just copying Mum. She's like, mix it up, do that, and it's lovely. But her thing wasn't lovely because it was made from mud and grass. And I remember once when I was hanging up pictures, and then I looked down and my 4-year-old son's there with something that isn't a hammer and something that isn't a nail, and he's just sort of copying me. And all he's doing is he's following a human instinct to learn by repeating what he's seen, and that's a way of learning. So we teach people to do things by modeling it for them, giving them an example to look at, and then they can reproduce that, and then in time they can develop their own style of how to do things. And Hannah gave a mention of it. For example, when I got people to do second talks, I gave them a method. So I've just picked a method that's in this book. This book's a 5-part preaching thing. There's other books, but we just found this one was helpful. So I'd give them this book. I had a summary that I'd send to them, and I'd say, I want you to follow the 5 parts exactly. When you've done quite a few talks, you can pick your own style, your own format. But if you follow this model, then what I've found is it'll just keep you on track. And so the first thing, you tell a story, then you make the connection with the congregation, then you connect to the Bible, then you connect to application, and then you connect it to vision. And so it just flows nicely, and it gives people a really good way to sort of express a raw idea in a way that communicates and talks well. So that helps with that. Tacit knowledge we've already talked about, but is recognizing that a lot of what we learn appears hidden, and it's never in a book. It's not written down because it can't be written down, but it's something nevertheless that needs to be transferred as learning from one person to another. And that happens by participating together through the multisensoriness of seeing and observing someone else do something. Things get transferred. So I found, for example, with the Ignition people, is if they did one talk, it was as if now they became brilliant observers of other people doing other talks. And they would notice how they did it and like, oh, I get why they told that funny story at the beginning. They were like drawing people in, but it was on the theme, wasn't it? It wasn't just telling a joke and blah, blah, and then, oh, I can see how they da-da-da, and then that was the application, and then that was the vision bit. And so that kind of, some of that, you can only get it in a certain way. Like John Wimber used to say, it's caught, not taught. It's that kind of idea. And then lastly is scaffolding. And scaffolding is any way you create a structure to accelerate people's ability to do something. So it's like training a child to ride a bike. So you buy them a bike, but you put the training wheels on. And you go, why don't you ride a bike? Yeah, you can ride a bike. My kids, we taught them, wife and I taught them all to swim using the same thing. We had a swim vest, and it had floats that you could take out. There were 9 floats. So we could teach them in a week. So day 1, on holiday, camping site, swimming pool, you put them in the water, they're in this thing. Look at you, you can swim. You are brilliant, well done. You know, they paddle away to the edge. Next day, what do? You just take a float out and then Come on, keep going. It feels harder, Dad. No, it's not. Keep going, you're fine. Next day you take a float out. Next day you take a float out. By the end of the week, they've got one float or they've got no floats. So that's like scaffolding. So in the preaching examples, our scaffolding were someone will meet with you beforehand and help you in any way you want help. We'll rehearse together because we can build your confidence and we can help with any last minute adjustments. We can give feedback to draw your attention to what was good and maybe what you need to develop. The big idea was scaffolding. It was creating a framework where, hey, everyone in this room can contribute meaningfully to what we're doing because we've created a framework of scaffolding that enables you to do that. Okay, last two. We talked about workshops, but I think the thing that would be great to think about would be to think, what workshops do you have? Probably all of us here have multiple workshops that we can use. Like my examples of my team meeting was a workshop. Sunday was a workshop. The big idea meeting once a term was a workshop. And I had to have a plan for each one to know, how am I using this to develop people, and how I'm using it works differently in different ways. So you'll all have multiple workshops, and you could create additional ones as well. If you think, I have something that's not happening, you might think, well, what can I create that would be meaningful, genuine ministry, but would be a workshop where people can learn. And then the last thing is groups. The guilds had groups, and arguably there were two dimensions of learning that took place in the guilds. The first was between masters and apprentices, or journeymen and apprentices. So it was an individual coaching, but that's very time costly. The second layer of training is where we learn in groups, and the key is that they're peer groups. That's kind of the key. And there are myriad examples of that. You know, it could be a group of 3, could be a small group, could be the guild, like everyone that's involved in this cause, in this place, all the leaders in this church meeting together. It could be just the people doing youth work. You can create groups, and they can be a place where people learn, and it adds a second dimension, because in that environment, everyone can give input to others, and everyone can learn from others as well. Okay, let's chat. I've got some, oh yeah, I've unplugged that. Okay, I've got some much longer questions on the screen. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll tell you what, I'm going to allocate these questions to groups. So can we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1? Is that okay? Quickly talk you through the questions. How can you facilitate legitimate periphery participation? So remember what we said about that? To train focal leaders in churches. So how can you create the opportunities to allow that to happen? What might you need to change so that what you are overseeing is multiple communities of practice or workshops? Okay, so that's question 1. Number 2, talk about tacit knowledge. How can we transfer this tacit knowledge, the wisdom that lurks within our souls that needs to be passed from one generation to another? We know it really well in, say, families, you know, parents raising children. There isn't a book you give your children, you do life with them, and they catch it from you. And what they catch is profound and significant. It's not the icing on the cake, it's the main stuff. So how can we think about how we might pass it on? Because you all know tons, but do the people you're investing in, how will they get that from you? And then how will they pass it on to the next group? Group 3, maybe you just want to think about the idea of scaffolding. How can we put the safety wheels on? How can we create some kind of frameworks that allow people to take a step that's bigger than they're actually ready for? But if we provide this scaffolding, then they can do it, and then actually, therefore, it accelerates their opportunity to participate, and it accelerates the speed at which they learn. So that's group 3. Group 4, how might a church view learn? I'll tell you what, can you do question 1 again? I think that's probably not a great question to discuss here. So if you can group there, can you do question 1? Is that okay? And then group here 5. How might we recover mimetic learning, particularly in our society that's very biased towards do a course, go away to college, do a degree, then you'll be trained. How can we recover that sense of we learn by copying, by seeing, by reproducing? This table. Tell us what you were...
We were talking about, first of all, we celebrated what we're already doing with peripheral participation.
Yeah.
And we're doing a bit, which is really exciting to
Can you give us an example?
Yes, it's happening with Kids Church. We've got one leader who is just really wants to, well, you can say more than I.
Yeah, so he's only just recently started volunteering, but he wants to know more, wants to know things, and he's kind of like, he's nearly at that stage where he would take that role on himself, but he's kind of following and learning from as we're doing it. So hopefully in a little while he'll be able to kind of take on the role on himself.
Yeah, it does.
We have a group called Women Who Pray, and at the end of Women Who Pray, we do night prayer, and that's been really great because I hand out the leaflets and I say, right, who's leading tonight? Because it's all there. Someone will say, oh, I will, and everyone's had a go at leading, which they wouldn't. Oh yeah, that's another one. They wouldn't normally. So that's been really good, and PCC reflection as well. Thank you. So yeah, we're then looking at what are our other workshop opportunities, and they're really obvious. I think for us, the question is, how do we create capacity within the team to be able to coach people, so that it's not just a rota with people leading prayers on a Sunday, but actually that's got value because they're supported through. So I think for us to increase the peripheral participation opportunities means changing how we work as a team.
Yeah. Let's hear from the other group. Did you end up with question 1?
Yes.
Do you want to chip in and then we'll just land that discussion?
We talked around 3 issues. One was about boundary management, and then some rooms there isn't permission for other people to be present and changing that culture. We talked about collisions with the modulus unit principle, like particularly with young people, are youth allowed to be involved because they have their own thing. And talk around things like expectations that people want to raise up. And one of the examples we used while I brought it out was I've got in the last few years I've had people identify as leaders with strategic vision and passion and guarding the values and that sort of thing. And what I want to do is bring them into PCC, and that's exactly the room they don't want to be in. So there's this. So it's not just about releasing them in where they want to be. It's also the sense of, well, what do they want and how you work with their expectations. Is that providing with the question?
No, that's a good fit. And I think I would say some of my leaders were secret curates, meaning I was training them to be church leaders, but I just didn't tell them that's what I was doing. Miriam was a secret curate, and then one day she realised, she said, "You're training me to lead a church, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, you've noticed." But that's because I moved around, and I would get her to do different things. But there is something there about negotiating what's the fit, and sometimes helping people to see. I think it needs to be genuine, but to see an opportunity they haven't thought of as a good thing. Yeah. Sometimes that's not the same as I just need someone to do this, and I'm going to get you. That's different. But sometimes stretching people is adding a second thing. We do that in sport, don't we? You know, if you're a runner, then swimming helps. But you wouldn't necessarily figure that out unless someone told you, "Oh, swimming can really help you be a better runner." It's maybe that kind of thing. Do you just want to say, like, what are the barriers to doing that? Do you want to just press into that? Both of you that talked about one, yeah.
We sort of summarised that first question. You've got to be open to listen, as well as being open to give an invite. So it's very easy to sort of say to people, "Do you want to come and join in on this?" but you've also got to be able to sort of be willing to allow people to approach you and say, I'd like to get involved in that. In that second part of the question, what would you need to change in our practice for our churches to be communities of practice? To some degree, you've got to have a willingness to sort of change anything and everything, a willingness to take risks and release that control. So the example that we sort of came up with is, if we've got young people in our church, we might not be able to invite them to listen to a PCC meeting if we've got that late at night on a school night. So we might need to change that PCC meeting for a weekend, midday, but then also having a willingness to sort of say, well, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to let those young people feedback what they heard and experienced through that, and how do we think about that?
Yeah, great. Do you want to say on your table someone other than Hannah, barriers?
One of the things we were thinking about was confidence for some people.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, as you were saying, having to talk to people, you know, and encourage them, particularly maybe with service leading at the moment, we've just identified a bit of a gap. On the other hand, we've found that there are some areas where you'll find a few people willing to. So actually we found that having a bit of a small testimony slot, you get a few people to stand up, we will do that. On the other hand, we're struggling to get people on the, if you like, normal rotors for readings and intercessions. So we're doing those ourselves. So which areas do we kind of discern ones where people are knocking at the door, and which ones shall we say, well, we can do those ourselves at the moment?
Yeah. And I used to play with it, so I decided I like doing the PA because I'm a techie nerd. So I used to sit on the PA rotor, sometimes wearing my dog collar. That would really freak people out. They'd come in the room and they're just like, I can't see who's in charge. The guy on the PA desk has got a dog collar, and then you've got a teenager leading the service. So what's going on there? But so sometimes I often did the gaps, because I felt that's how I release the church. There are always some gaps, and I'll pick up some of the gaps, and some of that might be putting out chairs and, you know, basic servant stuff, which I shouldn't. So that's, I think, helpful. A few other thoughts. I think we are the key person, so it's our ministry mindset that is the key activator for this. Ask yourself the question, are you raising up supporters or successors?
Yeah.
Okay, is the church there to help you, or are you there to help the church? It's similar, but actually it's radically different. Here's another thought. I think a lot of people, this is not what happened to them, so it's really hard to reproduce it. Or if this is what happened to you, you reproduce it naturally. That's what I found. I didn't have to train Holly how to bring another student worker into the leadership team, because that's what was done to her, and she didn't know anything else. She just assumed every Anglican church does that, because that's what was done for her. But if you were formed in a different way, you have to consciously do it differently. And also, I think a lot of church leaders feel like, I got here the hard way. I worked jolly hard to get here, and there's something in you that feels like, well, I'm not going to, you know, they can jolly well work for it as well. And I think you've got to kill that. And you've got to decide, my competence is here to accelerate you. You will have a better story than me. And you'll get lots of benefits from it, but you probably lose something in your ego. Has to have a bit of surgery to press through that. And then I think you can reimagine how we do church to always go for the option that's about raising up people. So my example of getting 2 people to lead, why did I do that? Because it gives me a way of training someone. Ignition Sunday. You can think about the big ideas thing. All of those things could have been done another way, but we went for the way that helped us to do training. Table 2, do you want to tell us tacit knowledge? What did you talk about?
Just to pick up on that last point you made, when we were talking about focal ministers initially, we had quite a few people, some of whom had other ministry roles, going, oh, but you know, they should have to do X and Y, and oh, this looks like on the cheap, and oh, there's not enough training and all that kind of thing. Very interesting, that kind of response. and it fills into one of the things we picked up on tacit, and might be other things the others want to add, but the first thing we said was tacit knowledge isn't always positive. And we've got quite a few contexts where the tacit knowledge would be the vicar does everything. And the congregation utterly and 100% confidently colludes with that. So it's sort of that's a tacit knowledge we don't want to pass on. So actually breaking the mould sometimes. We're not saying tacit knowledge is rubbish. There's a lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
But that was one of the things we focused on in the discussion.
Like hidden culture, or not hidden, but culture.
Yeah, so it's about sometimes what we're looking for is a culture change, that we're communicating a different way that is not necessarily that we can't really write down. But there are some places where a culture is really strong, and so it's working out, particularly working with the leader, how they can embed the culture change first, so that they can then pass it on. And we've discovered some places where the leaders aren't ready to do that. The easiest place to change the tacit knowledge is when the leader's gone and they're looking for a new one, because we can bring about culture change there much more easily. So many unwritten rules. Church of England is like it's got so many unwritten, unspoken rules to it, and that's what we're trying to shift. And I think you're right that communities of practice are how we're going to do it, but it has to start with the leader. They have to own it.
Yeah, so interesting thoughts. And I was about to say something really good, but I've forgotten. How do we transfer tacit knowledge? Close proximity, okay? You can't do it 2 meters apart. You've got to get closer. You've got to say to somebody, come and do this with me. And that's how it gets caught, not taught. So I would say to anyone has opportunity to do this. If you're doing anything, you can say to somebody, hey, could you just do this with me? Even if it's just making the tea or anything we do in the life of the church that contributes to who we are, anyone can share any of that with anyone at any time and communicate it. And then the other thing is that, as they say, you never fully understand something until you've taught it to someone else. So often it sharpens you up. If you're in charge of the hospitality and you were training someone else, you might naturally talk to them about the why. We want people to feel really welcome, and people that don't go to church think that it's a terrible hospitality. So we want to do something nicer than they would expect. We want to exceed their expectations. We want to know that we've anticipated that they're coming and that we care. It's not about serving the drink. It's about smiling and saying, how are you? It's lovely to see you. And so often when you teach somebody, you relearn it yourself in a stronger way. So there's benefits in that.
So
Ian.
The refrain, the frequent refrain is, it's a great idea, but I haven't got time to do it.
Yeah.
When the quieter day comes. Actually, I think this is so helpful. I think when I was an incumbent, I realised there was virtually nothing or very few things I did that couldn't be done with somebody else.
Yeah.
And I felt that if I did anything by myself, it was a bit of a waste of time and opportunity. And so, just looking for almost anything that you, with a view to ultimately not doing it yourself, actually, it solves the problem of I don't have time.
Yeah. Yeah, often we think people wouldn't want to do it. We used to say to the team, we don't say someone else's no for them. They're so busy. Ian's so busy with his job, he'd never do that. No, Ian, give him the chance to say for himself. Often busy people can make stuff happen, etc. So we don't disqualify people. We often in our team meetings would do the list of the whole church, and instead of saying who might, we would say why not? Why not this person? They're in our church. Why not? Why not? Have we got anything for this person? And just try to go maximal empowerment. Table 3. What did you talking about? Scaffolding.
Well, we started by just observing that local ministers might have different ways in, I suppose. So they might not just there could be, potential for preaching, for example, but might be someone who's interested in human ministries. something, that there was something there. So we felt our first kind of step in the scaffold was to discerning and continually discerning and looking out for those people who God might be calling. So that's the first step. And the second step was invitation, asking people, and it might stop there, they might say no, but at least if it's part of our scaffolding, we know what we're doing next. What's the third step? I'm sure prayer was in there somewhere.
Yeah, some people need an invitation, but then also some people need permission.
Yeah.
Permission and opportunity, but with a safety net, which was another word for the scaffolding. Because if we just gave permission, then they might just fall flat on their face. So just kind of boundaries, kind of, yeah, but not too firm that actually it stunts growth.
Yeah.
But just so it makes them feel safe and they know what they're doing, or they can see what they're doing initially, and then might be able to extend beyond that.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing was the team, wasn't it? We said, we felt that if people realised that they were not on their own, that they were part of something else, part of some bigger picture and a team, that would be a big part of the scaffolding.
Yeah.
That's great. And then I think whatever you're trying to progress, you can probably just think about, how can I make it easier for someone to do this, safer? I don't like the term safe space, but you know what I mean. How can I make it? So scaffolding would be like how not to fall off the building. So how can I make it easier for somebody to not have a negative experience through that, and then enact some of those things? How can I manage this differently? And for any opportunity, there's probably some things you can think of. I think the other thing is we probably massively underestimate the confidence that we can impart to people by just expressing our desire and our intent. Just to say, I would really love you to do this, and I want to invite you to this, or I'm going to help you to do this, or that will be a brilliant talk, or I love the way you lead worship. Well, we give far too little of that. So when I transitioned to that role, when I had multi-site, I realised on Sunday, my main job on Sunday evening was encouragement. So I'd go home and I'd send so many texts, and then I'd send some emails, and then I'd send some cards, and then I'd follow up with some people. And I kept some lists so I didn't muck it up too much and just send texts to one person all the time. But I realised that one of the biggest things I can do is to say, thank you, well done. You did a brilliant job. I really appreciate you. I'm so glad I'm in this church with you. And I thought, oh, they know all that, they know that. But somehow we all need to hear it. And actually that's what that can activate them and give them confidence to do it the next time. Should we do the last group? You were question 5.
So we recognise that some of us already, in our own Christian journey, been through good mimetic learning because we had really good leaders who had allowed us to follow them and see what they're doing. And it was therefore probably easier for us to take on that practice with others, whereas if that's not the background it comes from, there's a learning curve there for you. But also we had an interesting discussion about the whole idea of the journeyman model, in that in the model that you gave us, the artisan would 3 months here, 3 months there, 3 months there. If there's one person within the church and you're the person that they are mimicking, if your skill set in that particular area isn't that great, then they may not develop to the fullness of their potential. So there's a real challenge there, isn't there? To say, you know what, maybe I'm not as good a preacher as someone else, so perhaps they need to go and learn from them. And that takes huge amounts of humility and self-knowledge in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, and often if you learn the same thing from a different person, you get it from another dimension. So it goes from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. You get a fuller picture. Things make sense in other ways. So but I agree. We need to find out. I mean, curates in the Church of England used to do 2 curacies. That was the norm. You would have your theological college and then 2 journeyman seasons, and then you would be a master. So how can we build that in for different roles? Anything else from that group?
You talked a bit about that there's, slightly overstated to make a point, but I think the point is valid, that in that model, sometimes the apprenticeship stage is missing completely. So some people go off to theological education who have perhaps, maybe they've been a focal minister, maybe they've led a Bible study group, maybe they've done some youth work, whatever, and then others will go and have had very little experience at all. And you're selected on potential rather than as much as anything. But the issue is then that they might be then, they do their theological education, then they do a curacy, and then they're asked, people who've not led a group of 8 Christians are asked to lead a group of 80 Christians.
Yeah. And mimetic learning is copying. So it's creating spaces where we see and are with others doing something. So that's just a basic thing. It's kind of getting people into the room. I think also activating curiosity. It's possible to be switched off and not learning, or it's possible to be switched on. So that's like the people that did their first talk, and then suddenly they're noticing how others do talks, and so they're learning. So they've been activated in their ability to learn. So sometimes a small activation can produce a whole load of self-learning, because every Sunday, lots of learning opportunities, lots of things are being modelled by people that we can learn from. Every leadership team, things are being modelled, etc. Yes?
I like this word activation. There'll be people who are really ready to be activated, and I suspect there'll be others that you go, oh, if I just put them here, I'll see them come alive. Do you ever have a stalled activation where you put someone in the room and you go, there's some thirst isn't there or something? Or is that not a category that exists?
So yes, that used to happen a lot. What I tried to do was make sure that opportunities were never destructive. So I was very anti-titles, because if you give a title, you might have to take it away. That's tough. I don't want to do that. So I used to just be people used to just think I was a bit thick about giving titles, but I was avoiding giving labels to things. I would just say, hey, do you want to do this? And then just leave it sort of hanging like that, so that if it didn't pan out, no one was embarrassed. I never said who was preaching next week, because sometimes a student would do something and it'd be like, mate, you're not preaching next week. So I never wanted to embarrass them. So and people used to say, why can't you tell us who's preaching? And I think, I know who's preaching, I just don't want to tell you, because it might need to change. The worship leader might need to change. We don't want that to be a difficult thing. And I think you can take it in steps, little steps. So think of it like the evidence-based. Each step is evidence-based. And I think also for us, it's learning that eye, to just see. It's like the farmer who knows when the fruit's ready to pick. It's very hard to explain, but it's a skill that can be learned. Sophie.
Just a thought, Christian. I imagine you to have been, or well, to still be, a person who's really able to do the difficult conversation well. Because you just described some quite difficult things there.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that person's going to be whatever. The modus operandi of the Church of England is to avoid difficult conversations. Can you give us, because for every invitation that we make to join in leadership in some way, title or not, there will be those difficult conversations to have. What's your top tips in terms of growing leaders about difficult conversations that you've learned? I think you know what I mean by difficult conversations, don't you?
Yeah, I do. For me, vulnerability worked, but that can backfire, because if you're vulnerable with someone who's going to be difficult, then they've gained some sense of leverage over you that can, and I know plenty of times that's backfired. But for me, being open about my past mistakes and the things I wasn't good at in church life, which was plenty of things, Some things were running jokes, you know, about disorganisation or that. That helped me have conversations with people about, oh, okay, you're not doing so well in this. It wasn't like I'm perfect and you're imperfect and the perfect person tells the imperfect person. So for me that worked, but I think that suited my personality. I think after a while these things were in our culture, and when it's in the culture it's a lot easier because people are working against the flow if they're pushing against that, and I think that's massive. So we had very little complaining or that kind of thing because I think we just set culture really well, and I did have difficult conversations early with people, and I often didn't enjoy them, but I just knew if I leave this, it's just going to be a more difficult conversation further down the line. And I also felt for the church. The bishops put me here to look after this flock, so the buck stops with me. So I can't go, oh, someone should deal with that. That is me. So if I don't deal with it, probably no one else will. It's easier in a plant because we set the culture from the beginning. I think it's harder in an inherited context because you're inheriting someone else's culture. We need to move on, but we'll have the last few comments.
I'm just curious in terms of how we use the model of apprenticeship, which I'm very much in favour of and use, but in a team setting with oversight ministers. So you've talked a lot about one of the last things that you've just said to us is that you wouldn't say who was preaching next week and you'd keep it to yourself. Well, if we're working in a team and as oversight ministers across several churches, how would we wouldn't be able to make that work, would we? Because we need to share a kind of knowledge.
I see. Yeah, that example wouldn't transfer, but then it probably wouldn't apply because in your team you're probably not having a conversation about who hooked up with someone on Saturday night and shouldn't be preaching on Sunday. I hope.
The model of apprenticeship is a very effective model, but we need to be able to kind of look at it in terms of some of the things that you shared with us across a team way of working.
Yeah, I think hopefully the examples I've given are illustrative rather than things to directly copy, because ultimately you've got to figure out what your workshop looks like and what the culture will look like in your context. John?
So is there something you're not telling us? So just thinking about, the Bible's full of stuff about God gifting people, and so then it's about finding out the gifts that God's given us. So my upbringing, if you like, in the church where I had all this happen to me, and a lot of the time people are talking about knowing the gifts that God's given you, the person who's apprenticing you, helping them to discover those gifts. Is that the next session, or is that something you've sat around?
Yeah, we'll cover that this afternoon after lunch.
There's something, there's a Holy Spirit thing, isn't there, in all of this?
Yeah, so I know exactly what you mean, and I think there are courses that do that are really helpful. I think also we had multiple options, so we didn't presume that we knew what someone might be good at, and some of the things were iconic, like the ignition thing was often a doorway into never speaking again, but maybe doing youth work or something like that. So it wasn't so much everyone that does this is being spotted as a preacher. It was just sort of, this is a church where everyone gets involved and we're all finding out what that might be. Should we take a 3-minute break and then we will cover creativity in 15 minutes. So I've already highlighted that one thing the guilds help us to understand is the power of creativity that was at work in a pre-industrial age. Now we live in a modern society, it's not like we're just going to go back to the medieval ages, etc. But is there something for us to learn about creativity? So let me apply it to 3 places. So the first place to apply creativity, I'll send you these slides, but some quotes. The first place is if we're starting new communities, if we're planting, if we're establishing new Christian communities, then we would agree that they need to be contextual. So clearly they have family values of the kingdom. They're authentically of the gospel. They're in a relationship to the diocese, the bishop, etc. So it's not that they're rogue, but it is. I'm sure we agree. We don't work on the basis that every church will be identical in its appearance. Every church is locally adapted. Yeah, and that's primarily in the role of the leaders to discern that and navigate that. How will we be an authentic Christian community in this place? How will we be heralds for the gospel to the people that we serve in this sphere of influence and in that context? So that calls for contextualization. So Michael Munya's written excellent stuff about that, just a short quote about that. But it just, so I think that's an obvious piece. The alternative is a kind of IKEA approach to Christian communities that I don't think would sit well with any of us. So what is the trait that gets us contextual thinking and leadership? I think the trait is creativity. So we need to know our stuff. We need to know our gospel and our doctrine and our history and our Bibles and all that stuff. But we need to add to that creativity so that we understand how to assemble those bits in the ways that they will be uniquely assembled for each Christian community. So that's why I think, particularly in the age we're in, we need to be upping creative thinking. And actually, it's not true now, but it used to be true that ministerial formation was about, we'll teach you how to do it, you faithfully reproduce it, and your results will be the same as ours. And we know we live in an age where that's subverted. Culture is moving fast, generations are changing quickly, and we're accepting that we're not equally good at reaching people in different places. So there are places that we've never reached particularly well, and therefore we need to be able to activate that creativity to address that. So that's the first point, and I think we just need to be able to dream and think about how do we build that into the formation of anyone that we're raising up, that they understand how to be creative with the authentic elements of our Christian faith that we've inherited. And just picture, if you want, the best picture would be, imagine you go to a jazz night and there's the brilliant jazz pianist is playing, and they play something that's never been played before. And you're sitting there and you just feel like they've absolutely nailed this. This song fits this room, these people, this time, this place. It is a perfectly contextual piece of music that's bespoke. How did that pianist get to be able to do it? They didn't just sit down for the first time and just go, black buttons and white buttons, let's just push a few randomly, see what happens. That would have been terrible. No, clearly they had a whole journey that got them to that level of creativity that actually began in the mastery of very elemental skills. They probably had to play their scales and do that over and over again and teach their fingers all the tacit knowledge. And then they probably had to play other people's songs first and get feedback on how well they were doing it. So that's a bit like my examples when I say, so you need to follow this template, and then when you're the great preacher, you can do whatever you want. But while you're learning, follow this template. So that's playing someone else's songs. Follow the models we'll give you whilst we're training you up in this stage, but eventually you will hit a point of creativity. And so at some point, then the pianist took a bold move and they began to step into a different place. And when I interviewed people for this as part of my research, what they said is the first stage is safe and protected, and then the second stage is like when the eagle kicks its birds out the nest and say, hey, time to learn to fly. Boom, and they're just cascading down to the ground, and at that point they either flap or hit the ground. And so the second phase of creativity feels dangerous, feels scary, it feels bold, it feels like it's taking risks. And it can come in progressively, but it's a different mode of operating. And all of us can do that. And I'll come back to that in a second. The second point is we need to be, not just to train people in creativity, but we need to be creative in how we train them, which means no two people have the same journey to achieve their formation. Of course, there'll be common elements, and pragmatically, there are bits that we might need to do in the same ways. But there's something about the master's role, the overseer's role, in becoming the one that sort of curates that journey or development, and seeing the evidence, seeing the development, being immersed in the conversation, drawing out from the person what's distinctive to them. So I can remember myself saying, for example, to some preachers, "You are a brilliant storyteller. That's when the room comes alive when you tell stories. That's probably your gift." Or someone else, it might be, "Do you know what? You've got the heart of an evangelist. It feels like you've got a passion for go for that." And they're going, "Oh, doesn't everyone do that?" No, everyone does not do that. You've got that heart. How could we help you be more of that? Or, "You are brilliant at explaining truth. Okay, I'm going to give you 5 books to read to invest into that truth." And so that is creativity as well in our roles, in that we are working to draw out each person's, how they're made and what they're called to, what God has put within them. And it means that we need to curate different experiences and opportunities within what's realistic to get them to do that. And I think it can be time consuming, and it's not imperfect, but I think it achieves a much stronger outcome in terms of people who are learning. So those are the first 2 points. The importance of creativity in our ministry work, that it's no longer optional, it's now core and should be common to the way we think, and that we need to be thinking creatively about the methodology that we use to train people, and we need to become the masters of that. We need to be able to think of lots of different ways that we can do that. The third and final piece is we all need capacity to build into our lives a space where we can keep our imagination going. And I'll read you a quote from Mark Batterson in a minute. But Rob Parsons calls this kicking leaves. I don't know if you've read it in many of his books. So he says every church leader needs to build some time into their week when they just kick leaves. And what he means is you just need some space to think and imagine and ponder. Some of this stuff does not happen around the boardroom or in the meeting with the agenda. It can, but some of it just happens when we have some unstructured time, when we can breathe, when we can take a retreat, even if that's for a few hours. Some of this comes by identifying who activates creativity in you. So Luke, who was mentioned, I found Luke activated creativity in me because he would always make me think bigger. He would always say, "So what's the ultimate dream, Christian? If this went really well, what would it look like?" And I think, "Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, and then it was as if he could unlock me into my creative thinking. Or, he might say, "Well, what's a different way? That way's not working. Well, what's a different way to do that?" Or, what's the blockage in here? Or so identifying who activates that to you. Sometimes I've got a friend that calls it, who's your dangerous person? Who is it dangerous for you to hang out with? Because you'll come away and you'll think, "Oh, I've got to make so many changes, and I'm far too unambitious in that, and I need to stop doing that so I can start doing that." So all of us need to identify how we can activate our creativity in leadership so we can pass it on to others. Let me leave you with a brilliant quote from Mark Peterson. He says this, Batterson, sorry. "Imagination is the road less travelled, but I think it's the pathway of prayer. Prayer and imagination are directly proportional. The more you pray, the bigger your imagination becomes because the Holy Spirit supersedes it with God-sized dreams. A good test of spiritual maturity is whether your dreams are getting bigger or smaller. The older you get, the more faith you should have, because you've experienced more of God's faithfulness. And it's God's faithfulness that should increase our faith and expand our vision. If you keep praying, you'll keep dreaming. And better yet, if you keep dreaming, you'll keep praying. Dreaming is really a form of praying, and praying is a form of dreaming. The more you pray, the bigger your dreams will become, and the bigger your dreams become, the more you will have to pray. Nothing honours God more than a big dream that is way beyond our ability to accomplish. Why? Because there's no way we can take credit for it. And nothing is better for our spiritual development than a big dream, because it keeps us on our knees and in raw dependence with God. So for you, and we need to end, for you, creativity is something you need to invest in and create space, and particularly a way just to be able to think about things you're doing and how you might approach them differently.
I try to find a little bit of scripture which will relate to the theme of the day, and I found myself drawn to a little passage in the Acts of the Apostles from Paul's first missionary journey. So there it is. He was commissioned with Barnabas and John Mark, you'll remember, in Seleucian Antioch, and they sailed to Cyprus. There was at least one convert in Paphos, the proconsul, but no sign of a church. And then they sailed into Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, made landfall at Perga. I couldn't see any evidence in the scripture of a church planted there, but definitely a church planted in Antioch, a church planted in Iconium, and a church planted in Derby. That's absolutely clear from the scripture passage. Lystra's a bit ambiguous. I've got a question mark against it, but the whole missionary journey, probably 15 months, something like it. At least 3 churches planted. I'm just going to go with the first 3, the first paragraph. They preached the gospel in that city. That city is what am I missing? Derby, thank you. And won a large number of disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. Strengthening the disciples, I imagine, is some kind of apprenticeship work. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. I thought about they planted the church with their blood. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they'd put their trust. Excuse me? Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church. So that the whole missionary journey is like 15 months. I don't know if they had 9 of those months in Asia Minor. They planted 3 churches. Now they're leaving, and before they leave, they appoint elders. I feel like we live a very cautious, inhibited version of the Christian faith particularly when it comes to raising up leaders and trusting people with responsibility in church life. I don't know if you know this book, Roland Allen, St. Paul's Missionary Methods or Ours. If you've never read it, I urge you to read it. It's 100 years old this year, this book, and it reads like it was written for 2022. This version was published in 1962, when the book was 40 years old, and the foreword was written by Leslie Newbigin, the great saintly scholar bishop. And in 1962, he was writing, I can't believe how current this book still is, 40 years after it was published. And the basic challenge is, how was it possible for Paul to plant churches and commend them to the grace of God and trust the nurturing of those communities to the Holy Spirit, when it takes our missionary societies, 70 years to raise up indigenous leadership? How did Paul do it in a fortnight? Now, I don't know if you know this, the quote there is from Archbishop Justin, actually. If you can't remember the last time you failed, you're not taking enough risk. I think we are inhibited. We're very, very cautious in church life, especially with raising up leaders. And I think Christian has just been inviting us to be a bit more daring and to recognise that there will be failures along the way, just to push some boundaries, experiment and try stuff. And Sophie and I and the other members of the senior staff are quite deliberately trying to foster a culture of experiment and recognising that means allowing for a certain amount of failure. That's okay. Now, there's a whole literature contrasting Paul's second missionary journey with his first one, because the places where the churches survived well into the 2nd century are mostly the churches he founded on his second missionary journey, when he spent a good deal longer, in 2 years in Ephesus. The places he was writing letters to, the Thessalonica, Corinth, Colossae, were churches he established on his second missionary journey. And maybe Paul's experiment failed first time. So maybe those churches in which he raised up elders after 2 weeks and commended them to the grace of God, maybe they failed. Maybe the church, maybe the disciples in Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch didn't flourish long term. Even if that's true, how wonderful that even the Apostle Paul was learning on the hoof, so that on the second missionary journey, he thought, okay, that wasn't so clever, I'll do it a different way now. But actually, we don't know that. The fact that Paul was not writing letters to those churches does not mean that they did fail. So even that's an assumption. Maybe they did flourish, maybe they didn't. Maybe Paul was himself doing some learning. Even on his second missionary journey, he was extraordinarily fruitful in a very short space of time. And I think I just wanted today to commend the giving of greater responsibility earlier than we might be comfortable with it. And I think we shouldn't read too much into Paul's failure if that experiment did fail. We'll pray. Our loving God, thank you so much for the extraordinary privilege of being co-workers with your Holy Spirit. Thank you that you are constantly at work and that our great invitation is to join in with you. We thank you for the places where you have set each one of us and for the lives in which you are at work in the communities where we serve. And we long to be a help to that work of your Spirit and not a hindrance. We thank you for all that we have learned together today. We pray that you would increasingly help us to get out of the way of your Holy Spirit and to be, as it were, like a good midwife to your Spirit's work. Help us to be good at raising up those you are calling into leadership. Help us to seek not supporters but successors. And bless us, we pray, that your gospel may be increasingly fruitful in the months and years ahead across this diocese. For the sake of Jesus our Lord. Amen.
Amen.